Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Thanks, Don, and welcome everyone. Welcome back. We've taken a short break in this series due to CMMC Boot Camp and Uniting Women in Cyber events that we had going on the last couple of weeks. But we're back now. Thanks if you participated in those events, and welcome back to the Town Hall. This is our continuing series of sessions on cybersecurity maturity model certification. My guest today is Jeff Baldwin. I do want to mention that we're recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is on organizations that are seeking certification under CMMC. And that's mostly who we have in our audience today. If you have some questions from the audience, please send those in on the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I'll try to work those into my conversation with Jeff. I'll start with an introduction of Jeff Baldwin. Jeff is the president of Space Coast Cybersecurity, a cybersecurity education and training firm. He's also a PhD candidate working on research on cyber supply chain risk management. He's a CMMC provisional assessor and provisional instructor. His career includes cybersecurity work for the government at NIST and the Defense Security Service, as well as government contractors, Battelle, CACI, General Dynamics IT, L3 Harris, and Leidos. He's worked as an instructor at ISC Squared and is currently an adjunct professor teaching cybersecurity at the University of Maryland. Jeff's been very active in the CMMC community, both with the PhD research he's doing, as well as with a series of LinkedIn articles addressing some of the sort of practical questions of interpretation of CMMC and related standards. We're going to dive into some of that today. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here with you.
So let's start with the work you're doing for your doctorate. What is your topic? What's the research you're conducting? Just tell us a little bit about what you're exploring there.
Absolutely. So my study is basically looking at the current adoption of NIST IR. That's a NIST Interagency Report 8276, which focuses on key cyber supply chain risk management practices. So if you're familiar with NIST IR 7622, 8276 kind of came out in February, January of this year. So it was based on 25 case studies that NIST did over the years. So I wanted to look at, okay, so you had those 25 case studies, but let's look at the wider adoption of some of these key practices. So in 8276, they have 8 key practices with 24 recommendations. So in that document, they have an Appendix A that kind of maps those 24 recommendations across the 8 key practices. And I wanted to basically use that table, and I have a series of questions and a survey that I ran from March through September. So 4 months I ran it. I got 121 responses. Now I'm kind of working on that chapter 4, which is the results. So I have all the aggregated results. Now I'm breaking down into the variables to look at, does the size of the organization, are they part of the DIB or not of the DIB? Are they a service provider versus a hardware or software? So I'm looking at that lower level variables to see what kind of differences there are across the responses. So some of the interesting things I've seen so far is about 33% do not have a CSCRM plan. So CSCRM plan, if you're doing federal contracting, some people have already seen that in some of their contracts. They've had a CDRL or a contract deliverable for a NIST 800-161 CSCRM plan. So at a program level, some contracts are already asking for a CSCRM plan. So 33% didn't have any of that, and 34.71 did not have a formal CSCRM plan. There hasn't really been that strong dictation that says you will have a CSCRM plan and you have to. We see it in 853 in revision 5 with the SR family, which kind of focuses a little bit more on anti-counterfeit and provenance of where the component has been. So that's kind of looking at the espionage side of it too. So if you get something in the supply chain, you get a little something extra in it because everything has a chip in it now. So you can have a little something extra in it. So looking at who has hands on it over that. So that's kind of a little bit of it. But basically, some other couple things, or 2 of the recommendations that were not very planned to be implemented. was propagating your security requirements to your suppliers, sub-suppliers. So that flow down we see in DFARS. A lot of the organizations, about 44%, aren't really tracking to see if their suppliers is flowing it down to their sub-suppliers. And similar to that, another recommendation that's not really widely implemented based on initial results is that mentoring and coaching your suppliers to improve their cybersecurity practices. So I think part of that is, the primes and the subs are focusing on their own cybersecurity kind of first, and it's hard for everyone. So then actually going to the next step and helping out your supply chain with their cybersecurity posture, their staffs are already, sort of stretched a little thin to be able to do that further level outreach unless you're a larger company. So that's really good what NeoSystems does with this weekly town hall to get that information out there has been great. And I know we worked together, year or two ago with L3 Harris when we did that initial outreach to our suppliers doing, 5 webinars and hit about, 3,000-4,000 of our suppliers. So that was a really great initiative.
So you mentioned the survey. Is that something that people could still participate in, or are you done at this point in terms of data collection?
For this particular study, it is closed. I closed it in September, going through those results now. I will probably have follow-on studies, and that's something I'm going to do is kind of as my pet project on the side is c-scrim.org. So cscrim.org is my domain. That's kind of where I ran the survey out of, and then I'll put the results there, and I'll probably make a benchmarking tool based on that. So you can take a survey to see how you compare against your kind of peers, and that'll be a tool that'll be coming out eventually. This is all unpaid though, so I got other stuff to do. So that's basically on my kind of my free time pet project on the side. And then I'll probably do research based on this survey, looking at some of the whys. So if there's a particular recommendation that people aren't doing, like the mentoring of your supply chain, why aren't we doing that? So it'd be kind of further studies that are more focused on that. So it's kind of just going to be kind of my little research and fun thing that I do.
So spell out the CSCRIM acronym for folks that may not be familiar. So it's Cyber Supply Chain Risk Management, yes.
Yep. So Charlie - Sierra Charlie Romeo Mike, cscrim.org.
Got it. Okay. So you mentioned some of the preliminary findings. I mean, pretty big percentages you were tossing out there that are not yet doing these recommendations. I mean, these are recommendations from the NIST perspective as a standards body, but from the DoD perspective, these are requirements, right? Flow down, et cetera. These things are in the DFARS today. Is it or not, right? Is this just new enough in contracts that people that are not doing it because they're not yet being required to? Or as you're looking at this, are these companies that have these requirements but either don't understand them or have not yet implemented them? What's your takeaway there?
I think it's also a combination of all of it, and I think a lot of people aren't even aware of it. NIST IRs in general don't get any attention. It's the NIST SPs that get attention, and kind of the relevant one is 800-161, which with the executive order, it was actually in revision 1 for drafts, and then the executive order that 14082 came out. They kind of put a little more focus on supply chain, so it's got rolled up into some other initiatives, and it's going to take a little longer to come out. But that also has some practices in there as well that have foundational, sustaining practices and enhancing practices. So I could have focused my study around those practices, which have actually overlap with 8276, but plus some additional stuff. But I really like the way 8276 laid out that chart in Appendix A. And I also really like that it was a final document, not draft document. So I don't think CSCRIM is very well known. When I was actually surveying people, so I put out my announcement for a survey and didn't really get much responses through just kind of posting it. The LinkedIn algorithm is really bad. Like you put something out there, nobody sees it. So I ended up doing direct messaging based on keywords. So I would search through people and then direct message them. I asked them to participate. And I found that not a lot of companies have CSCRIM type rules or CSCRIM, really as a term if you even go look at jobs for it, like the only one that's really hiring C-Scrim is maybe Boeing, Raytheon, and Amazon, actually. Amazon has a pretty big C-Scrim practice.
Interesting. We've had quite a few clients talk about it lately, so it's definitely getting an awareness, and I think because it's showing up in contracts. So in the news this week, Nicholas Shalan, the first chief software officer for the Air Force, talked a lot about the supply chain risk, et cetera, when he was in that role. But he made some fairly provocative comments about, you know, if we don't wake up now, we have no fighting chance to win against China in 15 years. And he was talking about artificial intelligence. He was talking about cyber, and really trying to, I think, get people's attention. So those gaps that he talks about, I mean, do you agree that we have those gaps there? And when he says things like "wake up now," how would you translate that into action? Like, what do you think is needed for people to do to close that gap?
Yep. So that is a big question, and I'm not really qualified to speak to our capabilities across AI and machine learning, but I definitely see need for it. And one of the best ways we could use that machine learning is kind of to build on the old kind of heuristics of, detection. So we kind of had the heuristical IDS, but really goes back to a core of like systems engineering and, system security engineering, which is kind of like having an understanding of your system and what's normal for it. So if you know what normal behaviors, what approved behaviors for your system are, then you can look for those kind of anomalies. And, instead of having, an analyst do that manually, kind of, searching and querying, having that machine learning to kind of assist would be kind of a great thing to do. As far as kind of like the cybersecurity, it kind of goes back to me like starting with the basics, right? Access control is kind of access control, RBAC, auditing, integrity monitoring. These are all kind of common things that a lot of organizations don't do well. And to compound on that is we have multiple frameworks that all ask for the same thing a little differently, and they don't really always map nicely. So you have the CMMC, you have RMF, you have PCI DSS, you have all these different frameworks. You have ISO 27001, like high trust, any of those things. So you have these core things that aren't really done or done well, and kind of a lot of it is people want to have the technical solution. Even looking at CMMC, you probably give it about an 80-20 split. 80% of it's non-technical processes and procedural stuff and documents and policies. And then the other part that people want to focus on is that 20% without really looking at the governance side of it. So you need the governance side, you need to have the requirements, you need to have traceability, you need to make sure you're doing all those things. And it's difficult. And one thing I wanted to mention is like another recommendation is a lot of people get to cybersecurity in different ways. People take different career paths to get to this field. But one thing that would benefit everyone is kind of get some education on systems engineering and really what that process is. But you can summate that as saying you have an idea that you want to turn into a capability. That's systems engineering. Systems security engineering is taking that idea, turning it into a capability that is secure and has assurance of the information that you want to have protected. So kind of getting a firm grasping of that will actually be helpful too when we talk about like scoping, right? So another thing a lot of people like to talk about is like the scoping guide. Where's the scoping guide? How is scoping? And scoping to me is a overloaded term that has a lot of meanings to it. So you have scoping as part of like 853, in the categorization and select security controls, you tailor it then. That's one thing. With 171 in CMMC, that tailoring's already occurred. So you can't tailor things out. That is the baseline. Those are the controls and practices that you have to do. But when you're taking those practices and controls and you view them as a system outcome of what you want the system to do, you then take that and you flow it down to your system components. So not all of your system components will have all of the system requirements. So doing that traceability analysis, you say, all right, I have this system component has these requirements. I have this system component with these requirements. Then I look at how do I implement each one of those. So then you write about how it's been implemented or the procedures and how to implement those requirements for each of the system components. And then you have the verification step. So in systems engineering, verification is, did I build it right? So did I build it right? So based on those requirements and your documentation, your policy, how things have to be built, did you build it right? And that's verification. So having a verification step for all those implementations that you have gives you that full traceability analysis. And then you can also take those verification steps and procedures and work with your C3PO for CMMC to say, this is how we have implemented and how we verify that what we've implemented is in place and accurate. And just to finish the thought, right? The other half of verification validation is that validation piece, which is answering the question, did I build the right thing? So verification is, did I build it right? Validation is, did I build the right thing? So that's going back to understanding all of those practices and controls and understanding the intent behind them and what it's trying to protect against, and then looking at your own implementation and seeing, did it actually meet that intent? So that's kind of that validation there.
And I think you're right. There's the people who come at this business have very different backgrounds in terms of whether they have the formal engineering expertise that you're talking about or not, right? So one of the things people look for from CMMC specifically, but government in general, is they want to see clarity. And so one of your other kind of side projects, I guess, pet projects, has been, you've written some very interesting articles on LinkedIn about specific items within CMMC and how they can be interpreted, how they should be interpreted, what the government regulations really say, to help people get to that clarity sometimes that they're looking for. One of them was, what does not applicable mean? When you mentioned a minute ago that, you know, the tailoring has been done. When you get to a standard like CMMC, they've already selected, these are the controls based on the kind of data you have, the sensitivity of that data. These are the kind of controls you want to mean. So if somebody's building a system and they're going to mark something as not applicable, what does that mean in that context? And, you know, do the regulations allow for that? There's an allowance in there for exceptions to be granted by the DoD CIO. Is that the only path to NA when it comes to a CMMC standard or a NIST 800-171 standard? Or is it something that, you know, system builders can decide based on their own analysis?
Yeah, so that is an interesting one. That's my latest article, and it seemed to be one of the most popular ones. And there's two parts to it, right? There's 171 and then there's CMMC, and they are distinct separate things. In the DFAR 7012 clause, that's kind of talks about that procedure and how you can get approval from the DoD CIO for either a not applicable or an alternative security measure. And kind of DoD's terms, not applicables are kind of meant for something that the system is not capable of doing. So it's not capable of doing it, it should be not applicable, whereas you may have a business reason of why you can't do what's been specified. And then you can kind of get an alternative security measure that's gives you the same level of security, but it meets it. So under that process, right? So 171 has that overlap of 130 with CMMC, actually 110. So there's 110 controls in 171 that overlap with CMMC. So for any of those things that overlap, the DoD CIO in that quote told me that anything that you get that's a not applicable from them, approval from the DoD CIO for not applicable for 171 should carry over to CMMC. So that same practice that you had not applicable for under 171, under CMMC, your evidence changes, right? So now the evidence that the assessor would look at is that kind of letter that says, hey, you're approved to not have it, and then kind of that cursory check, that verification that says that's actually true. So you say you have no wireless. Do you actually not have any wireless? Let me look at your system. I don't see any wireless. We're good there. For the Delta 20 and the other things that don't exist in 171, there may be further guidance that comes out from the DoD, from ANS, that says, you know, hey, you actually can determine whether you want to do not applicable or not for those things. We haven't gotten that guidance. What my typical kind of understanding and background generally is that the system owner, the data owner, is the data owner is the one who specifies what requirements they want. So you're not the data owner for that CUI, you are the data custodian. You follow the rules based on what the data owner has said that they want you to do. So with that said, you don't really have that authority in my understanding and guess. So anything that's 171, you can carry over. Anything that's CMMC Delta 20, to be seen whether we can have the contractor say not applicable for that, whether they'll accept that or not. One other thing that I kind of hinted at, but not applicable does not mean do not assess. You still are going to have an assessment, just the assessment procedure and the evidence and artifacts that you look at will be different. So kind of answers that question a little bit, and a little bit to be seen on that.
There's some people too, I think, that try to abuse that not applicable status, where it really means, we've ignored this control. So you mentioned the circumstance where the system's not capable of it. I mean, do I have a duty to design a system in a way that it is capable of it? I have to meet these requirements, right? So if I want to declare, encryption at FIPS 140-2 to be NA because my system's not capable of it, well, wasn't I required to build it to be capable? I mean, so I think there's, I think taking those to the DoD CIO for adjudication is going to be a moment of truth for people who maybe were thinking they would make those decisions themselves or hash it out with their CMMC assessor. And we have yet to see whether the assessors will have that kind of authority. I think the answer is going to be no, though. At least so far, if you look at DIBCAC assessors that are out in the field, they don't have the authority to make that decision. They'll tell you they're taking it back to the DoD CIO, is my understanding. Is that what you're hearing as well?
So that's an interesting one. There is a concept of assessor discretion. Again, when you look at these quote unquote requirements, they're more, so that's kind of one of the points too, is a lot of these NIST documents, they don't really tell you how to do anything. They don't prescribe how you must do something. It's just that it's easier in your mind if you kind of view those practices as kind of the desired outcome. So are you able to produce that desired outcome? So like, are you able to limit access control to people that actually require the access, that need the data, and only them, are you actually doing least privilege? So that's kind of like your desired system outcome, and you can come at it from several different ways. So one of the things when I'm going to be an instructor and I'm going to try to teach to assessors is that it's important to understand your own biases. So when you come in, you have a background, you know what you're familiar with, but you don't want to be closed-minded to the fact that, well, this is the only way I've ever seen it done, so this is the only way that's acceptable. You want to keep a flexible mind and look at what is that practice's intent? What does it mean to protect against? Let's look at their implementation. Is it true and accurate to what they say it is? Are they actually following it? And does it actually still come through with that same outcome? Again, because there's a difference between a requirement and a specification. A specification is telling you what you must do, whereas a requirement is telling you what that desired system outcome is.
Excuse me. Want to switch over to a topic, or one of the other articles you wrote, which was, putting CUI labels on things. And there's talk in CUI, in the CMMC standard about, there was in the draft a requirement to identify and label CUI straight up, and that's actually gone away, but we still see labeling requirements in the assessment guide. There's labeling requirements on media, so labeling media as opposed to the actual documents themselves that might contain CUI. So you got to label the media that might contain that data. And one of the comments that you made in your blog post, I would say anybody who's interested in reading the deep dive on that, go to Jeff's LinkedIn page and look for that CUI labeling article for sure. One of the comments you made on that was that we've established that appropriately configured virtual desktop can descope an endpoint, meaning we don't have to worry about CMMC compliance of the endpoint. This is something we've discussed before in this series. For example, situations where the endpoint is only used to access the VDI, and therefore there's no sort of persistent storage of CUI on the endpoint. In my mind, this is something that's not been fully clarified by the DoD, but your comment made it sound like you're pretty convinced. What's the background there? In what cases do you believe we can descope a laptop that's used to work with CUI when that CUI is located on some remote system, not on the laptop?
So that was based on a question and answer to the DoD CIO again. That was kind of one of those hypotheticals of, hey, if I configure it this way and it's a VDI and there's no actual transfer, there's no way to copy paste, there's no way to transfer files, there's no way, it's just straight up keyboard, video, and mouse traffic. That's all you're seeing. So you're just displaying it on that endpoint. Under that, you know, that response there, and it wasn't to me, it was secondhand. So I saw the response, and multiple people have kind of asked that, and it's kind of breaking that way. I mean, it can break either way with it, and to one way it might break is you may end up that an endpoint could be like a level 1, and the enclave VDI could be a level 3. And that's kind of what I would expect to happen, but we haven't got that formally or anywhere yet. But that's what I would expect, is that you can have, you know, your organization could be level 1, and you want to use your primes, you know, your primes level 3 enclave to do your work. And then you can just kind of piggyback off of their infrastructure and get it. Because really what's coming back is you're not actually getting the actual files or the data. You're just getting a visual representation of the data that's being processed centrally. So it's not being processed locally on your machine other than those images coming across. So that's kind of the context of that one.
In your mind, how is that different than working on a document, say with Google Docs, right? You're in a web browser, you go to Google Docs, you go to Google Workspaces, and you're working on the document. The endpoint is just rendering the document in the web browser and transmitting back keystrokes, mouse clicks, right? So it's that same keyboard, video, mouse scenario. Same scenario, different? I mean, obviously there's links there to download and other things, but does it matter if you do those things or don't do those things?
Yeah, so that's you kind of hit on the main differences there. So you are processing it, you know, remotely. The actual word processing is happening remotely, and you're getting the display back, but there's no kind of assurances of the data flow, right? So can you move things up and down to Google Docs? Yes, you can. And a lot of organizations block it because, you know, it's a path for exfiltration. So that's kind of the main differences. But if you theoretically could create a Google Docs implementation with high levels of assurance and pen testing to show that, hey, there's no local files that can be retrieved after the session. There's no way to enforce, there's no way for data to transfer back and forth between it other than just kind of that visual representation. So like a VDI has a more structured kind of container around that than a Google Docs and a web browser, which have a weaker container that you can have. So kind of hitting back to the scoping discussion, the best way to understand your scoping of what's in scope, out of scope for your system is to have an understanding of your data flow, which also touches back on that concept of the machine learning of understanding your system. In order to protect your system, you have to understand your system. You need to understand your inventory. You need to know what you have. You need to know where the data goes. So it's kind of going back to the question of, are we going to lose the cyber war? If we can't answer where our data is and where it goes, then yes, we will lose the cyber war. That's kind of a core concept of, what do we have? Where is it? Where is it going to? Does this device ever touch CUI? No, not in our flow, but could it technically? Is there anything preventing it from touching it? Well, no, then it's probably in scope. So it's all about your assurances of your data flow and where your data is going to answer a lot of these questions.
So we've got just a minute or two left. I want to jump back to the labeling of laptops and maybe jump to for anybody who didn't take time to read your blog post, what's the verdict? Do we need to label our laptops if they have CUI stored on their hard drive? And are we labeling the actual storage media, the laptop case, maybe displaying a warning banner prior to login, some combination of those? What's your take on the requirement there?
So informal, right? I'm not an authoritative source, but I would say no, you don't. So you're going back to what the practice and the goal of the practice, the outcome. It says label, right? So you're labeling it and going into some of the documents, you can label it electronically with a warning banner when you're logging in, with a header banner that's electronic. or a sticker. So really what you're getting at is that you're alerting the user that there's a presence of CUI on this device. So for a laptop, you can do that electronically by booting it up and seeing that, oh, there's this on there. In a lot of cases, it would make sense to put a sticker on a laptop, but again, labeling does not equal stickering. Sticker is one way to label. So it's not the only way to label, but it is a way to label, and it's the way most people probably understand. And to the point of, a removable, if you look at all the examples they give for it, they're all kind of more removable media with like a USB stick, with, a DVD, with paper. These are all kind of distinct objects that as a user, you look at it and you say, okay, I don't know if that's CUI or not, but now it's labeled, I know it's CUI. With a computer, you can know through your security awareness training, all computers have CUI or these computers have CUI. So there's other ways you can kind of meet that same intent of, does the user know that there's the presence of CUI on that device? And that's kind of the main takeaway there. So you can do it. I would argue that you don't necessarily have to, if you can still meet that outcome through other mechanisms, whether electronic or not. And one last thought is that, a laptop does have a media in it, but a laptop is not a laptop without the media in it. It's just a shell then, right? So a laptop is a laptop, a hard drive, and a removable hard drive is a removable hard drive. Once you take the hard drive out of the laptop, it's no longer a laptop. It's now just a hard drive. So you would want to label it because it's not as part of the laptop. But then there's also that concept of, labeling a container. You can view the laptop as a container. So there's still some jury out on that one, but my core thought is always, what is the outcome of that practice? And it's to make sure people are aware that they have requirements against that CUI. So as long as you can achieve that, I wouldn't fail you for it.
I think the outcome is key, right? So you think about who needs to know and when do they need to know. So if you're worried about the laptop, for instance, being repurposed for something else and that data is left on there, that problem is solved by encryption, right? So I might put a warning banner or a label on some media to prevent its reuse unintentionally, right? But in the case of a laptop where I've got full disk encryption on there, which I hopefully do, that laptop and the media inside of it, if it does get repurposed by somebody, stolen and reused, the CUI is not compromised, it's encrypted. So I would say no need to label it for that purpose. But then when somebody logs in, when they actually enter into the laptop and then the data is now decrypted and visible, you want them to be aware. So I would personally think I would look at a warning banner that appears at the time of login and not worry so much about the physical device, which contains only encrypted data until you log into it. I don't know, does that jive what you're thinking there?
And there's nothing wrong with putting it. If your organization decides, hey, we want to put laptops on stickers on laptops, they're free to do that. There's nothing preventing them from doing that. So, and again, especially if you are in a mixed use environment. So if you have an FCI laptop next to a COI laptop and there's no way to tell them apart, then maybe it makes sense to put stickers in. But if your entire enterprise is approved for level 3, maybe it doesn't make sense to label them all because it's implied that everything is level 3 in CUI.
Well, Jeff, the last few minutes, we've definitely been in the weeds a little bit. And you've written some of these articles, again, that tear apart these very detailed items and gives all the cross references. So I appreciate your work to do that. As we think about these questions of interpretation where people are looking for clarity, do you worry, this is just sort of as a wrap up, because we do need to close things out here today. Do you worry that people sometimes use those as a distraction from the bigger risks, things that have not been fully implemented across the DIB that really need to? Some of the things you mentioned earlier that we don't see widespread implementation yet, things that have a huge security impact, but yet people may be focusing on smaller things that aren't as important. Do you see that as do you see that happening?
Yeah, there's something to be said for that, where you can spend more time fighting against it than actually doing it. So the amount of effort that you put in against doing it, you could have already done it. So there's also that, but it kind of goes back to, for me, the organization, if you're viewing all of CMMC 171 as desired system emergent properties, the system outcomes of those things that you're looking for, And then you're viewing it as kind of a guidepost to building your own security program if you don't have one, right? So, and with that, you'd also want to look at like Appendix E of 171 for all those NFO controls, which are implied and assumed that you're already doing, which a lot of people aren't. So that's one of the big surprises they've run into with their technical debt for which they haven't implemented. But view that as kind of like the guidepost, the outcomes that are desired, and build your security program. Do what makes sense for your company and start from there. So, you know, you have that first check, right? So verification, say exactly what you're doing, document what you're doing, and then actually do it. And then the second part's what you're getting in more into is the validation pieces. Is what I am doing satisfactorily meeting what is looking for there? And that's kind of where you can kind of do that own analysis on your own. And then you can bring in your consultants and say, hey, I'm doing this. Is that good enough for this? Because I know they're asking for this here. But again, remember, they're not being proscriptive and telling you what you have to do. So getting that third party, somebody else independent to come in and look at it and say, before, you know, you pay for a C3PO, for instance, hey, I'm doing this. Do you think that's good enough to meet this outcome? So that's kind of how I'd gauge it.
Jeff, thanks. I really like your focus on looking at the outcome. What are you trying to protect against, and doing the things that make sense? So I think that's really good advice. I want to thank you for your time today. Thanks to you. Thanks to Wade Forbes, our Sketchnote artist, who's been drawing this in real time. We'll send that out to everyone after the call today. Thank you for joining us. Those folks in the audience, mentioned that our next session is going to be next Wednesday, October 13th at 1 o'clock Eastern. So please join us back for more information on CMMC and the practical aspects of making that a reality for all of us in the defense industrial base. If you have some questions about these events, please go to our website, neosystemscorp.com, where you can find all the details. Thanks, everyone.